First of all, today, if you're viewing this on the 10th of March, if it's current, then I want to announce that next week on Tuesdays, I will not be teaching the Bible studies, the devotionals. That day, they will be posting the midweek Bible study that the other ministers are teaching. And what I'm wanting to do is give a space for those to be what we watch on that day, what we view. And then on Monday and Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I'll continue to do these devotions. And I think it helps for that to be what we're looking at. And I don't want to be in competition with that. I want us to be able to take in these lessons. These men are putting a lot of time and effort into viewing. And at the same time, it'll give me a day in the middle of the week, a break. And so that'll be starting next week. Now, for today, that lesson will be at the regular time, this evening. And Brother Johnny Payton will be teaching. And back to our lesson. Today, I want to talk about David and Mephibosheth. In 2 Samuel, we read where David asked the question. His kingdom now is established and God had blessed him. And he asked the question, is there anybody of the house of Saul that I might show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Not Saul's sake. Saul had been a nemesis to David and spent years just trying to chase him around and was very jealous of him. But Jonathan was a good man. And David said, I want to show kindness for his sake. And there was a servant of the house of Saul named Ziba, and they called him to David. And he said to him, is there not somebody of the house of Saul that I can show kindness unto God for him? And Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan, but he's crippled on both of his feet. And the king said, where is he? And he told him where he was. And so the king David sent and brought him from where he was. There, verse 6 says, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, fell on his face, and he paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul, your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons, and he had 20 servants. And Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. And now he was lame on both of his feet. And here David is just looking around, trying to find a way that he can show kindness to the house of Saul, because he realizes that it wasn't their fault that Saul spent his latter years pursuing David, and he didn't have a heart towards God. And so God, had spoken to Saul and said, I'm going to remove the kingdom and give it to somebody else. And of course that was David. One of the hardest things to do is to act when to react would really be easier. And it's difficult to kind of tamp down a reaction when we really, need to act. And acting needs a cause, for us to act, for us to go in the correct order and do the right thing. It requires quite a bit of effort and discipline, but reacting is triggered by something. It's triggered by an emotion that might be a desire to get even, a desire to set the record straight, but it's not always a good thing. But acting is based on how we view things, while reacting is again based on feelings. To show kindness to Saul's house was in line with David sparing Saul's life twice. It's in line with the same nature David had when Saul sought to kill David and running around, and David was running from place to place, hiding in caves and wherever he could. And he could have killed him on two occasions. And he made it known to Saul, but he spared his life because he realized he was the Lord's anointed king. It was actually, he was staying on course rather than just falling into the same pit that Saul was in. And showing kindness to the house of Saul, it was really not wavering, even though there was a pull to waver or a pull to react. And acting is harder than reacting. Acting shows that we're reading the script, we're going by the principles of God's word, and we're doing what's right. To act and do it correctly rather than being pulled aside by our emotions. 1 Peter 2:21 says, "For this were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled did not revile in return. When he suffered, he didn't threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously." So like Jesus, we must be bound to that higher purpose and reminded constantly that that's what we're bound to, is a higher purpose. Jesus could have called 72,000 angels on the night of his arrest, but he chose to follow the plan of, instead, the greater cause of taking sin away. He came to seek and to save the lost, not to retaliate. Our human nature feels the need often to retaliate in order to even the score, or to protect our interest. But if our interests are above, then our earthly reactions are minor and could even be counterproductive. We must keep our eyes focused on that higher order and be thinking daily that we are to follow Christ and truly follow him in every way. And we must be about others, not self-centered, not self-focused, but others. We're meant to align ourselves with a higher purpose and move into the field of ministry toward others. What can I do? What can I do for this family that's down and out? What can I do for the house of Saul? It wasn't their fault. Can I show kindness? And what David did was he took a wrong and he made it right. And it wasn't Mephibosheth's fault that his father had messed up in his latter years and spent his life and time jealously pursuing David while his kingdom, was attacked from without. But David just made things right. We know that it would have been enough for David to let Mephibosheth eat at his table from time to time, invite him over for special meals. But he went way beyond that. To restore everything to the king's son was really removing the reproach of being the son of an outcast king. He set him back to the order he would have had his father been a good king. He made things right. 2 Samuel 4:4 says, "Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. And his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth." So you see, it was whenever they fled that Jonathan, the son of Saul, he was 5 years old when the news of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. They had died on the same battlefield on the same day. And his nurse took him and fled. And then he fell and became lame on both of his feet. Saul had been rejected by God, but Mephibosheth wasn't to blame for that. And David made up the difference and paid him back. Our kindness should really look for ways to make things right. So in doing that, we exalt the nature of God, the kindness of God, and we show that kindness. That point where we stop and allow God to work, it's like setting a stage for his merciful demonstration. It's like setting a place for God to demonstrate his love for people. We actually create opportunities for divine works when we act in humility and kindness. And nothing but good can come from something like that. Freely we have received. Jesus told the disciples, he said, freely you've received, freely give. In Romans 8 and 30 through verse 32, it said, and those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. What shall we say then to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? So we've got all things coming toward us. The key part here is he gave himself up for us all. Basically, that's our blueprint. That's the line, the path we should follow. And, you know, today that standard is the one that we walk in, putting others first and then putting ourselves second and saying, what can I do? What can I do for the house of Jonathan? What can I do to be kind? David had lived through the torture of having a father-in-law that wanted to kill him. Instead of being angry and seeking revenge, he realized it was God who was in control of his life. And once in the palace, he looked around and he thought, they shouldn't suffer. The kids shouldn't suffer for the mistakes of their father. What can I do to give them some honor and to put things back right? This also showed that David had completely forgiven them. He didn't have malice or revenge in his heart. Even whenever Saul was in the cave and he didn't know that his men were hiding in that cave, David took a sword and cut the edge of his robe. And then David went out after Saul had left and he said, look, this is how close I was to you. I could have killed you. And David regretted doing that. He regretted cutting the edge of his robe off, even though he easily could have killed Saul and perhaps been excused for it. 1 Samuel 24 and 6, it said, he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. And yes, that anointed of the Lord was making David's life terrible, chasing him for a couple of years all over the place while he lost territory to enemies. And Saul was so focused on his envy and jealousy of David. And yet David later says, you know, I wish I hadn't even retaliated that little bit that I did, because he is the Lord's anointed. And then Saul was killed in battle, him and his son Jonathan. And David wrote a beautiful lamentation of Saul and Jonathan, lifting them up to a high place, a song that would be sung forever, so that people, instead of remembering that Saul was wrapped up with revenge and jealousy and anger towards David, instead, there's a song that David wrote, and they would remember the words of the song about how wonderful and beautiful Saul and his son Jonathan were. You know, it's really one of those things that touches us in the place where we really hurt sometimes. It's hard to let go of things. It's hard to let bygones be bygones. But here the Bible shows us it's always better to take the high road. It's always better to take the godly road and say, Lord, I realize vengeance belongs to you, not me. You're the one that makes things right. And I just need to continue to pour myself into life and do all the good I can do and let you take care of those who haven't been as good. You know, in a story like this, I never read it and try to think, well, who in my life am I wanting to get even with? You know, we must, I'm sure we're all past things like that. But it does show us that we don't just regulate our good and aim it toward good people, but we look around and say, I could be good to anybody. Because there's certain people that may be dealing with things and they may come across in a little bit the wrong way, but we have to understand everybody's fighting a battle. Everybody has their life they're trying to work out. And it's not my place to judge them. It's my place to say, Lord, let me just do something kind. Allow me to be that reflection of you in somebody's life today. I hope that helps. God bless you.